ready. Can we hear from you now, please?
Yes, sure. Thank you very much from me too for the invitation, which is greatly appreciated. I'm coming to this with quite a long-standing interest in the idea of place as a focus for public policy, which is something that's been gathering momentum in different places, I think, for some years. Then obviously in the UK, through the levelling up agenda, it's become a sort of major area of interest and focus. And I think, following on from Justine Greening's very interesting interpretation of it, I think what's striking is that if you listen to government at the moment, we get actually a range of different answers to the question of what levelling up is about, what the core ambitions are. And I think they range at one end of the spectrum to quite ambitious goals, the kind of things Justine's talking about, right across to sometimes more narrowly conceived ideas that really this is about regional productivity and about evening up regional economic performance. And of course, there could be a range of things in between those two ends of the spectrum. So I very much welcome your inquiry here. I think it's very important, much needed, to give some greater sense of definition, I think, to this quite amorphous concept. On social infrastructure and public services, it seems to me that often the focus has been, as was said previously, quite a lot on physical infrastructure projects, railways, roads. And actually, we've tended to forget that public services are also forms of infrastructure, and that they're key to generating the kinds of social relationships and community resilience which create the conditions in which prosperity and growth can happen. And I think it's important to have that shift of mindset here, because I think we've become very used to seeing public services as costs that need to be controlled rather than investments in the fabric of places. And it's quite striking, actually, thinking of the Sustainable Development Goals, which were mentioned, that often when we talk about these issues in developing countries, we do tend to recognise that health and education are integral to economic development. But when we look at the UK, we tend to push those issues to the side. So I think there's an important change of focus that's needed. And equally, a focus on the kinds of infrastructure that can be brought into play together. The sort of, how can we have infrastructure investment that complements each other? So from physical across to social kinds of infrastructure. To give an obvious example of why that's important, of course, making, say, Oldham connect better to Greater Manchester is a very important thing in its own right. That's a transport goal. But it's not going to do that much in terms of levelling up if the kids who are educated in Oldham do not have the skills that enable them to get jobs in central Manchester. So it's always about more than just one type of infrastructure. The final thing I'd say is just that I think in the context of COVID, there's an additional reason, I think, to think about public services in relation to levelling up. And that's that there is some really interesting, important research conducted mostly in other countries, which does suggest that places that have a strong civic infrastructure and that have good levels of social capital in them tend to be more resilient. And there's evidence that at times of crisis, those places do better than other places that have very similar demographics. There's some interesting work that the American academic Eric Kleinenberg has done. And I think in the context of the challenges we face now as a country, as we move out of COVID, I think that's very important focus to consider. Yes, just a quick answer to Lord Young's question. I think potentially yes is the answer to that. I think one of the interesting things that has begun to happen at the local government level is a number of different authorities that are starting to think about undertaking audits of the different kind of assets that fall within their jurisdiction, and to think about that those can be civic buildings for civic purpose, but also increasingly to think about assets that promote a healthy social life, and also natural assets, which actually also increasingly, I think we're coming to realise the value of those. And that actually leads towards quite an interesting development. It relates to some work we're doing at the Bennett Institute on natural capital, and whether actually natural capital ought to be brought on, ought to be considered on balance sheet. And that's a movement that is of great interest actually in the private sector, and also there are various governments that are looking at that. So I think the potential implication of my argument is indeed in the direction that you suggest. Yeah, I think I'll try and give an answer to both questions in one. I mean, I think first of all on priorities, I think there is a risk if there are too many priorities. In a sense, there are no priorities, and I think there has to be some. Government is really going to need to make its mind up, I think, what its core objectives are under this pretty big heading. But I think in doing that, and this goes to the geography question, I think what it needs to do is figure out what is the problem, what does it think is the biggest problem that it's trying to tackle. And that takes you to different geographies. If one view, it says that if we think about, say, productivity in the context of the UK and where our weaknesses lie, that the real weakness is what people call the second tier cities, those cities outside London that compared to other similar types of cities, and certainly in Europe, have underperformed significantly in economic terms. And one view says if that's the problem, then we should focus levelling up on those cities, and that they will ensure better connectivity to their hinterlands, and that will actually help dynamise those regions. But there's a second view which says that actually we need a different geography because the problem lies beneath that level, and that the problem is about smaller cities on the edges of big cities, and also to do with many towns, particularly large towns, and particularly towns in former industrial regions. And if that's the problem, then you're thinking of a different geographical scale, and I suspect a different sort of policy mix comes to the fore. I think actually it's in those places particularly where social infrastructure might make more of a difference than it might in the first place. And I should say there are subsets within that category. I mean, coastal towns and regions arguably have their own incredibly significant entrenched problems as well. So I think it is about establishing priority, and in turn, it's about having an account of what the real problems are. Thank you very much. So a number of different questions there. Let me land on measurement first of all, and just unpick that a bit, because I think part of your question there links to the question of goals. What is it that we're trying to measure? There's also another aspect of that question that I just want to bring into the conversation, which is whether we've got the resources that would enable us to measure what it is we're trying to do. And I mean, one real challenge here is about the quality and nature of the data that is available in relation to a number of the goals we're talking about. Because, I mean, as anyone who worked on this area knows, I mean, there is a lot of data out there, but it is incredibly difficult to bring it together, and particularly bring it together at a single level that would mean that we can look at education and health and employment, earnings, and various other things, indicators of well-being we might want to look at as well. There are very few pieces of data that can be readily brought together at a granular scale. I mean, some of that data works at a sort of macro region level, some of it works at the city level, and some of it, less of it, you can use at a more local level. And that is a real problem, because if we are trying to pursue a number of different objectives here, we're obviously going to have to think about trade-offs. And if we're thinking about trade-offs, we need variables. We need a number of variables to look at. And I think this is a very big issue. And I actually think it's something that ought to be, it's not a side issue here. I think it actually ought to be an integral part of what government is thinking about doing on this. I think there's a real urgency about the need to create some sort of data infrastructure which actually can call upon ONS data and which faces into government and has access to governmental data as well. I think that's crucial. So that's one thing. I think, but on measurement more generally, my worry here is that the risk is that we fall into the pattern of valuing the things that we are able to measure.
Yeah.
In other words, rather than measuring what it is, we decide to value. So the things that government is used to measuring are things like GDP and productivity. And those are things that operate at that very big geographical scale. And they're important, undoubtedly. And it may be that government sets its priorities around those, as I said earlier. But if we think that levelling up means some of these other objectives as well, because they relate to things like productivity and boosting economic growth, then we are going to need to think about how we go about measuring these other kinds of objectives. And I'm not confident at the moment that we can do that in a terribly robust way. So there are a number of practical empirical problems there. I think it goes back to your point about, there's a question here about time frame. I think that's links to this, but it also opens up a different issue. You know, there is a history here of attempts by different governments, and Justine referenced some of these, to develop regeneration programs. We've had a focus on regional economic inequality for several decades in this country. Different governments have attempted it. And there's very little evidence to suggest that much can be done quickly in any of these areas. So there needs to be a realism here about the time frame, which would be relevant to these sorts of interventions and the sorts of funding programs government is developing. And that raises the particular question about what can be feasibly done in one electoral cycle. What is it that the current government can actually credibly do in this area? And so I think there's an important calibration that's needed there of objectives, finding the kind of data, making that rigorous, and then trying to measure those objectives as we go along. Yeah, I would echo a lot of what has been said already. I mean, for me, the starting point here is what's at the level of principle. Why might devolution be a good thing in this context? And one reason is that it would enable people who are much closer to the areas that are being affected by decisions. It would enable them to make decisions based upon a deeper understanding of those areas, their economies, and the communities in them. And there's also something here very important about, I think, the kinds of information that you have if you are working in a council or if you're at a combined authority level, which you just cannot have. It's just impossible to have if you are sitting in a central department in Whitehall, because this, of course, is figuring up on something Justine said, is a two-way process. There's awful lot of things going on the ground that are incredibly important for government to know about and indeed build upon. So for those two reasons, I think devolution is important. Then I think the third reason goes back to priorities. I think actually there's an interesting question here about whether, if we do have a meaningful system of devolution, which is arguably we don't have it as yet, or we're still waiting for the white paper, but if we do have that, would those local leaders be empowered to determine some of the priorities, or are they merely enacting the will of those at the centre of government? And I think that's actually a very big tension in the debate about devolution and levelling up that needs to be played out, needs to be debated more fully, because those are, I think, two slightly different models. And we've seen already in the context of COVID some friction in the system as a number of leaders push back against some of the priorities that were set by central government in the context of regional lockdowns and funding. The final thing I'd say is it does seem to me that actually the combined authority model, here I echo Jonathan, that's been built in quite a painstaking way. It's taken some while to bed down, as these things do, but we've got some really important examples of innovation in our governance system. We've got some successful authorities with higher profile leaders who've begun to deliver interesting policy answers to some of the questions that we're talking about here. And it does seem to me it's very important that government respects that and builds that into any model of devolution that it comes up with. It does seem to me that actually the geography of a number of the combined authorities, and some of that is debated, but Greater Manchester geography seems to work quite well for that area in terms of delivering more accountable and responsive decision making. Well, let me have a very quick go at answering that question. I'm sure it won't be a comprehensive answer, but I think it's an incredibly important point because one of the obstacles to devolution, as you say, to proper devolution, has always been the worry about postcode lotteries and the fear that some core services would be delivered very differently to different standards. And I think it is incredibly important actually to acknowledge the role that central government would have to still play in relation to any system of devolution, not just in overseeing, providing guidelines and oversight for devolved policy, but also arguably what I think would unlock devolution here would be a commitment from central government, in whatever colour it is, to some sort of universal service offer, something that is guaranteed for citizens. I mean, we're focusing here predominantly on England, but it's an interesting question whether that ought to be extended or further. And I think it would be something like that would actually enable people to feel more comfortable with a model of devolution, which did involve more innovation and some differentiation in the ways in which services were delivered. That said, I mean, it's often the argument is that, well, devolution is a risk for that reason. But we do have, I mean, look at health now. We have a system that actually is delivered very differently in different parts of the country, and there are all sorts of different outcomes and different levels of service, as we know. So it's not as if the model we've currently got is providing uniformity of service, but I do think there's something there about rethinking not just the role of devolved authorities, but what the role of the centre itself would be in relation to devolution.